Hi guys, welcome again. Hope you are good. In this video I will talk about API gateway resources, methods and stages. We will also see the format of API endpoint. So without further ado, let's get started with the AWS console. So this is my AWS console. Let us go to the API gateway service. In the last video we saw how to create a REST API with Lambda backend where we created this API. If you haven't watched that video yet, you can find the link in the description box below. So let us go inside this API. So first is resources. Let us first understand what are resources. In the context of API gateway, a resource is the most fundamental building block that represents a part of your API's URL structure. An API consists of a collection of resources, and each resource is associated with a specific path. For example, suppose you have API for managing users, so you might have a resource like get users. So this /get users is a resource, and we expose the resources as a tree with this slash as the root resource at the top of the hierarchy. So whenever we create a resource, we begin with the root resource as the parent, and we add child resources under this parent, and we can continue this hierarchy by creating resources under each new child resource. For example, in our API for managing resources, we can have a resource like insert new users. So let us create a resource. The parent for this resource, we want to create this resource under root. So the name of the resource would be insert user. So now we have this insert user under root. So now we have created a new resource in our API. Let us now talk about methods. So what are methods? Here you can see the resource details. The path of the resource is /insert user, and this is the resource ID generated by AWS. And then here we have methods 0. So with this resource, no methods are yet associated. So what are methods? Methods are HTTP methods. Resources can have HTTP methods associated with them. For example, the common methods are get, post, put, delete, etc. And these methods define the operations that can be performed on the resource. For example, in this resource get users, you can see we have created a method get for this resource. So the purpose of get method is to simply retrieve data from the server, which in our case is the Lambda function at the backend. So similarly, for a new resource added, we need to add a method. So suppose for this insert user, we want to add a post method here. So we will click on create method and select the method type. So these are all the method types available: delete, get, head, options, patch, post, put, or it can be, we can also select any. So for our insert user, we would select post, and the integration type is Lambda, which we saw in the previous video how this integration works. So click on choose the Lambda function and click on create method. So now as you can see, we have now attached a method with this resource. Let us now talk about stages. After creating the API, we need to deploy it. So when we deploy an API, we are creating a deployment, and we need to associate that deployment with one or more stages. So when we click this deploy API, we need to choose the stage where your API will be deployed. For example, a test version of your API could be deployed to a stage named beta. So now when we click on this stage, we see here we already have a stage named dev, which we had created in the last video. So suppose the last API changes that we did, like we created a new resource insert user and we want to deploy this change to a new stage, say in the test stage. So we can create a new stage, we can give it name test, and we deploy the API. So in the test stage, we deployed our new resource insert user. So stage is a snapshot of our REST API, and it is a named reference to our deployment. And stages allow us to manage different versions or configurations of our API, such as development, testing, or production. And stages allow us to manage changes and updates to our API independently across different environments. And each stage has its own set of configurations such as caching, logging, and throttling, which allows us to tailor the behavior of our API in different environments. We will talk about these configurations in upcoming videos. So there are some common use cases of stages, which are like for development and testing we may have separate stages. For example, dev stage for development and testing purposes. Developers can work on new features and changes in this stage before promoting them to production. Similarly, we can have a prod stage, which typically represents the production environment where your API is publicly available for external consumption. Another use case is versioning. You can create stages to version your API. For example, you might have a V1 stage and a V2 stage to manage different versions of your APIs concurrently. And each stage also provides a stable endpoint URL that clients can use to access the API. So if you go here in the stages and go to any API, then you can see the complete invoke URL for this resource. And if you click on the stage, then you can see here we have got this invoke URL. So for our test stage, the invoke URL at the end, you will find this test string. Similarly, for the dev, you will have this dev here. So for each stage, we have a different separate URL so that you can independently work on these different stages or different environments. So now in the invoke URL, the format of the invoke URL, if you see this host, this is the default host of our invoke URL, which has several parts. So first part is this API endpoint. This is the ID. This represents the ID, API identifier that is generated with the API gateway. So if you go here in the APIs, you can see this is the ID of our API. So in this invoke URL, you can see this is the ID, then execute API, this is the fixed string, and EUS2, this is the region. This represents the region, AWS region that you have chosen for creating your API. And then this amazonaws.com is the domain name. You can have your custom domain name here. For example, domain name created from Route 53, you can have your custom domain name. You can configure it through Route 53 for your API. So this was all about in this video about resources, methods, and stages. I hope you have liked the video. If you like the video, please share your comments, and if you have not already subscribed, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you.